Let's get going here. Well, welcome everybody. We have a very interesting guest here, and those of you who I've had an opportunity to speak to about Josh will validate the fact that Josh, I have indicated to everyone that you are probably the smartest guy I've ever met in my life. Um, I'm very pleased to have you on the show. Josh has an amazing encyclopedia of knowledge. Today, we'll be talking about mostly about compliance, but yeah, no, Josh and I have done some work in the past, and he's always impressed me with just his level of knowledge and skill is off the charts. So I'm excited to have him on the show today. And we'll be talking, like I said, with a focus on compliance, but Josh has many different skill sets. So, Josh, from a high level, why don't you just tell people a little bit about who you are, what you do, maybe talk a little bit about Eyra, get a plug in there for Eyra, and then we can go from there about just talking about compliance and stuff.
Okay. My name's Josh Moore. I've been doing security consulting in one way or another for over 20 years now. Started a few different security consulting businesses, and now I'm doing my own thing with Eyra Security. I've really focused on kind of where the biggest needs were. A lot of people follow, whatever's cool and sexy at the time. When it was APT, everybody was doing APT stuff. But it's where people need help is more interesting to me. Looking at the messes, looking at the challenges, finding new ways to solve those problems is much more interesting than rolling out a new tool. And that's really where I focus.
Um, Maybe talk a little bit, Josh. You have a couple of books that you've written, and one of them is actually, I find it to be quite cool. I think it's available through the comic. Talk about the comic book a little bit.
Oh, the comic book? Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I was first learning how to give presentations, what I realized is everybody wants handouts of the presentation. But if you design your presentation to be handouts, then nobody's listening to you when you talk, and they're just reading the slides. So what I decided to do was make a presentation that was all visuals, so I could talk and people would pay attention. We'd have good back and forth. And then I turned that presentation into a comic book that became my handout. So that one's downloadable on my site for free. Back when I was traveling to shows, there were printed giveaways and things like that. But
Um, if would you be okay if we kind of passed out the link to the people
sure,
in
that's
this thing?
perfectly
So
fine.
yeah,
Yep.
so Piper, I'll get you the link for that, and I mean, let's shoot it out there so people can take a look at it because I think it's a pretty, you know, number one, it's interesting. Number two, it's very consumable, which is super important. With that, in this space when you're trying to educate people, uh, producing artifacts that are consumable is important.
Right.
So I think that it's good. And are you working on something now, or?
Yeah. So it's been a long time since I've written a book. I took several years off for various reasons. Previous books I've written, I wrote one on how to assess vendors. I wrote one on, basically working with others on the FortiGate world. That one's well outdated now. I did one on how to get a job. And I did one with a couple of friends on how to break into the information security industry. What I'm working on now is it's not even an update of the assessing vendors book. It's much bigger, much more significant in scope, and it really reflects how things have changed. Because back when I wrote that, HIPAA was new. The idea of we need a vendor management program was relatively new, and I was just focusing on the assessment piece, right?
Right.
How to pick a vendor. Now we have concerns about management. We've had a lot of years to really get things horribly wrong, and this book basically is collecting everything I've done for probably the last 7 years on vendor management consulting into a single tome, largely so I can stop having the same conversation over and over again and start having more interesting conversations.
Right. So you do a lot of work in the compliance space. Let me ask you this question, and I kind of get this asked a lot, or it gets presented where a customer will say, "Hey, I want to be compliant." When you get that question, what do you usually, when someone comes to you and just says, I want to be compliant, my first question is, well, what does compliance mean to you? Is my question. What do you do when you get that general blanket statement?
Well, first I challenge them on it because nobody ever actually wants to be compliant, right? They're being forced to be compliant for one reason or another. And finding out what those reasons are really matters, right?
Yeah.
If it's PCI compliance, if it's HIPAA compliance, those were the classic ones back in the day. These days, there's a lot of discussion around CMMC, though that's not really gaining traction, I think, the way the different people promoting that had wanted it to.
Right.
I think that's going to change with some of Biden's orders and things like that. But today, there's more interest than there is actual people working on it. Um, and then I would really take whatever framework they want, whether oftentimes it's SOC 2, sometimes it's ISO, sometimes it's straight PCI. So it really varies. Doing one right now on TX ramp, which is a variant of FedRAMP that only applies in Texas. And what you do is you walk through the requirements. You need to identify the scope, like what's the scope of the audit going to be. Try to only include the elements that matter. The ones that are pertinent. If you can scope out legacy systems, that's important. But I do require that those legacy systems not be part of the environment, right? You need to firewall those off. You need to do the actual security pieces. You don't just want it to be a paper exercise. But when that's done and the scope and everybody has agreement, then it's a relatively simple matter of doing a tabletop and walking through the requirements to see what's easily available and what's not. And then, if it's an active compliance consult, I'll start collecting the evidence for all the easy stuff. And I like to take 2 days, just work with everybody on the team, get all the easy stuff done, because that can take a list of maybe 200 questions and answer 180 of them. And then you've got the rest of the runway to deal with those ones that are difficult. And I find that that's better. A lot of people try to do it backwards. And what happens then is, as the clock ticks and as you get down to the end of the process, you will find that you don't have enough time to get everything else in.
Mhm.
Right. So I really start with the easiest stuff first so you can buy the time you need to do the biggest work.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. So, back in the day, it was, HIPAA, PCI, they were kind of the 800-pound compliance gorillas. So
Yeah,
what do you see out there now? What are the most frequent, most common, I don't know if I want to say standards, but just
yeah,
compliance frameworks that you're asked to
sure.
look at?
So a lot of people are interested in NIST. Usually NIST 853, where possible, I try to push them to the latest revision. Unfortunately, a lot of policies and procedures are written to version 4, not version 5, and version 4 is a lot harder to work with. Um, so I see a lot of NIST. I see a lot of SOC 2, and outside of the US, I see a lot of GDPR and a lot of ISO. Uh,
When you say SOC 2, one of the things that I always understood about those types of things is that they're an attestation and not a certification. But I guess I would ask you, is that your understanding of things? I mean, I see people going, well, you could be SOC 2 certified.
right.
I mean, is that to me, that was never a thing.
No, no,
It's,
it's not a thing, and
yeah,
there's the word certified makes it sound like it's
right.
a bigger deal. And in the IT industry, right, we have individual certifications in different industries like architecture, right? You can be leads, I believe, certified and other elements like that. Um, the difference is with a person, when you're certifying a person, you're certifying that they have the knowledge, they have the technical skill they need, and it makes sense that once they've established that, they'll continue to have it. With architecture, you're establishing that it's been designed and built according to particular specifications. And once it's built, they're not going to unbuild it and rebuild it in a broken way. In IT, just because something is true at any given time, that doesn't mean that tomorrow your AV is not going to break, or you're going to have a logging problem, or you're going to build a new network with something else. So the concept of certification doesn't really make sense in the way that it does elsewhere.
Mhm.
Um, ISO certification is a little bit different. because that comes from the manufacturing world, and you're certifying a process. And you can certainly say, as part of an ISO cert, you're going to certify an IT process. But
Hmm.
that means you cannot change that process in spirit, right? A little few
Hmm.
tweaks, improvements here and there, but you can't change the process once you're certified, or you're going to lose that certification.
Hmm.
Um, Most compliance audits are about point in time, and they say, yes, at this point in time, you're fine. The classic problem there is with PCI, because you can be certified, so-called certified, right? You can go through a PCI audit with a QSA, pass with flying colors. And if you have a breach the next day, they'll send a different QSA, figure out why the breach happened, and say, well, you may have been compliant one day, but you weren't compliant the day you were breached, so we're going to fine you,
Hmm.
right? And a lot of things are going in that direction. So that's just the world we're in.
So with that, I mean, one of the I'm gonna use the word misconceptions, but one of the um thoughts I run into is people think that it's a magic shield, that when they gain, I'm going to use the wrong word, air quotes, compliance,
Yeah.
that now they have a magic shield. And in my experience, the magic shield doesn't exist. Would you
Yeah.
agree or disagree with that?
Mostly agree. So the problem here is, in the early days of HIPAA, there was a concept of safe harbor. And if you had the data encrypted, if you lost access to that data, the data got leaked. If the data is encrypted, you fall under this sort of safety net that was put up. Some laws have these kinds of safety nets built in, but we're really seeing them being taken away as new laws are passing and new requirements are passing. The idea that you can do this one thing right and protects you against everything has really been proven not to be true.
Josh,
Okay.
may I ask a question?
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead, Ken.
Um, you just mentioned that the encryption part, which has always been my understanding, that when you were involved in HIPAA and a laptop got stolen, but it was encrypted, that you were safe at that point as the organization.
Yeah. Well,
Has that
so
changed?
it depends on what the word safe means,
Okay.
right? Are you safe from all forms of prosecution? No.
Mhm.
Are you safe from the specific provisions in the first generation of HIPAA? Yes.
Okay.
Um, from a real world perspective, is the data able to be decrypted? It depends on how the laptop was encrypted, right? Back
Mhm.
in the day, there are a bunch more encryption solutions than we have today. Sophos has sunsetted their solution, right? I used that for a long time. And the reason is Microsoft has their own native. Linux has its own native. Apple has its own native encryption. The Apple's is on by default. But the thing is, if you don't have that TPM chip in a laptop that's encrypted, then that decryption key is on the disk, and people will know where to find it, right? It doesn't take much forensics effort to unlock that drive unless it's securely set, unless the keys are securely stored in TPM and
Mhm.
that TPM module is properly configured. So it's no longer anywhere near as simple as the data is encrypted, we're fine. You have to know how the data is encrypted, what context the data is going to be used in, right? We used to try to get around data encryption requirements by encrypting the full hard drive of servers, for example. But people like me were pointing out, if the server's on, it doesn't matter if it's encrypted because the data is right there; it's accessible to anybody. And we're starting to see financial world mostly pushing for column level and field level and row level encryption based on how the database is designed. So it's gotten a lot more complex, and it's going to continue to get more complex as people investigate quantum computing and how that applies to specific implementations of encryption algorithms.
I understand when you get to quantum, you're done with
Well, that
encryption.
that's sort of misstated a lot as well, right?
Yeah.
There are certain algorithms that are particularly weak when you get to quantum. Quantum machines are purpose built, right? But like the old ASICs that you would get in network devices. If you build a quantum machine specifically for cracking a particular type of encryption, then yeah, it can crack it faster. But that doesn't mean that it opens everything up, right? It's not magic. It's faster it's problematic for particular types of encryption. And the solution, really, I was just talking to a colleague this morning about this, is to, when you look at your data, identify not only is it sensitive, but how long is it reasonably sensitive, right? A list of salaries, that's a sensitive document. 5 years later, much less sensitive, right? Because so much has changed. And looking at what the lifespan is for these different types of data really can determine whether or not you need to use a quantum resistant form of encryption.
Okay, thank you.
So, I'm going to ask this. I'm going to ask this question, and stick with me here. The question is, so why do it? And I mean, there's obvious reasons, but I'm interested in kind of your thoughts around why do it?
Well, so why do encryption at all? Why do
What
quantum?
compliance?
Oh,
Why do compliance if it doesn't protect you? I mean,
um,
it kind of protects you, but if it doesn't protect you from litigation or fines, or
well, so what it does is it establishes a baseline, right? Compliance establishes a baseline across the industry, and that's got good and bad to it, right? The good is that you set expectations. You have a list of, if you're not doing these basic things, then you're not where you really need to be, right? It really builds maturity directly in, which can then get taken into contracts, can be added to law. I'm not a big fan of technical security requirements going into law because things change faster than laws do. But in general, those are the pros. The downside is there's cost, and there's always your challenge of if you claim to be compliant, then any attacker going after you knows all the controls you have. Right now, hopefully, you'll have more than the baseline. But if they know what the baseline is, they know not to bother with certain things, and it helps them fine tune their attacks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because that's kind of the biggest question that I get is, well, if it doesn't protect me from litigation,
Mm-hmm.
if it isn't my get out of jail free pass, then why should I do the spend, or why should I have the spend?
What it does is it protects you against charges of negligence, which is significantly bigger than any violations you might get in the terms of fines.
Right. It protects you on the per instance side of things as well. I would assume there's a cost avoidance piece of it. So, all right. So now let's dive into this other weird new space we're in. What about AI in compliance? And,
Yeah.
does the buzzword chat GPT,
Yeah.
does
So,
that have any implications in your
yeah.
world?
Chat GPT today is an interesting and amusing novelty, right? And the problem is it's half of an important system. And we're just starting to see it being integrated with the other half. So Chat GPT is a new interface. It's an interface that uses a chat model for a user to work with a computer. So it's like we finally have what people wanted back in the late 60s with Star Trek, right? You talk to the ship's computer, it talks back to you. The difference is that ship's computer had this massive library of information. Chat GPT doesn't, right? Chat GPT is based on this large amount of information, but it's based on it to get linguistics working properly. It's not, when it gives you an answer, it doesn't verify the answer. You give it a web page, it doesn't actually go and check the web page, right? Those are all pieces that need to be built. And there are companies working on building it, and it's fascinating to see what some people are doing. But as of today, Chat GPT is really good at solving the blank screen problem, right? You need to write an essay, you need to write a policy book or something like that. And then you say, write 3 paragraphs on this topic. It does that. And you can look at those paragraphs and say, okay, this is what I need to write it about, right?
I had it write a cover letter for me once.
Nice.
Not that I'm interviewing. I just thought it
Right.
was I just thought it was interesting because I hear all the stories like everybody does about it's doing, this research paper, that or whatever. So I was like, well, write me a cover letter for a position. And it literally produced a generic, I mean, it was a
Yeah.
generic sounding, but passable cover letter.
Yeah. And the thing is, what it does really well is show you what an answer looks like. It
Yeah.
doesn't give you
Oh,
the
that's a good
answer.
point.
Yeah, it gives you something that looks like it could easily be an answer, right? I have a friend that when ChatGPT came out, he started asking it technical questions and it referred him to an interesting paper. What was interesting about the paper is it was
Hmm.
written by him and he never wrote it.
Really?
It created a title, it created an author. It says that we know this is an author in this space. We know this is what the title would be. Go read this paper, but the paper does not exist.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, because it's doing it linguistically.
Hmm, hmm,
BS as a service basically is what
hmm.
it is.
Interesting.
And it speaks with confidence when it has no data, right? And it speaks with confidence because it was trained on data models where individuals on the internet were authoritative, speaking with confidence, right? For this book I'm
Hmm.
writing, I asked it to generate a table of contents for a book on vendor management. And looking through that, it's like, oh, there were like two things that it put in there that I didn't have in my outline. So I added those to my outline. Useful. Not really world changing yet. It becomes world changing when it plugs into other stuff. They're plugging into Bing with ChatGPT. Google has the Bard project. It's clearly where we're going. There's a lot of AI in the EDR and MDR world doing analysis. I think it works well for that. But for Chat GPT, the biggest thing is you got to use it because this is where the future is, but you can't trust it because it doesn't have a back end expert system.
The latest iteration of whiz bang stuff I've heard it does is the integration into Teams, Microsoft Teams, where you
Yeah.
can say, give me a 20 slide PowerPoint on this, and it'll
Mm-hmm.
generate the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So
Well,
a lot of very well-dressed, good-smelling young executives will probably be using that.
and it's interesting where we're going, right? I talked to some lawyers about it. It's like, can we use this to write contracts? Can we use it to summarize contracts? And I'm like, yes, but that creates a world in which all people, all lawyers are making laws more and more complex to address all these different things, but nobody's actually reading it. Everybody's doing summaries from AI, and that's going to be problematic, right?
It's funny to me how we're turning into idiocracy.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very interesting. But yeah, I mean, if I wanted to have a master services agreement, I could. Well, so another example, my son is started doing construction, right? He does
Mm-hmm.
works on houses, does landscaping stuff like that, and he asked me, he said, "Well, how can I use Chat GPT to become more efficient?" I'm like, hmm. So I checked it. I said, well, let's look at this. And we did I said, list me a materials list for a 12 by 14 deck. And it spit out a list. And I said, well, take a look. Is that, he said, well, that's about 80% right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I mean, if you can cut out 80% of the work, and it was interesting. It's like you said, it's kind of not the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
but it gets you part of the way.
Well, the cardinal rule I follow for outsourcing is if a vendor can do something faster, cheaper, or better than you can, and the places where it's not faster, cheaper, or better are acceptable, then you should outsource. And I think what we have is a situation where it's certainly faster.
Hmm.
It may well be cheaper. It's unlikely to be better, but
Right.
it is where better fits acceptable. And I think as the technology gets better, people are going to lower their standards so they can do it faster, which
Hmm.
means as a world, like as a group, we're going to be doing more work faster at lower quality levels. And what's that going to mean for the things that matter in our lives?
Hopefully the deck is closer to the ground than it is farther. But I mean, on that a note, the next step was I asked it to produce a set of instructions to build the deck.
Mhm.
So which it did in an expected fashion. But the thing is like now there's an artifact. So if he, in order to do more work, needs to hire somebody, he can then give them a set of instructions and they have a framework. Now they're not, but they are a framework to do that work with. So
Yeah. So
there's interesting pieces to it. I don't know that it's trustworthy yet, but it's
no,
interesting.
yeah, it's not trustworthy, and it's never going to be as trustworthy as we want it. I liken it to a 17-year-old kid that's been hired by a business and put in charge of a bunch of stuff because, let's say, his father is an executive, right? So you got to talk to the guy, you got to work with him, but he's going to speak authoritatively on every single thing, and it's going to be really annoying. Um, for your son, I think what you need to look at is what parts of his life are slowing him down. What does non-billable work look like? What can he do to raise his billable rate? And in the construction world, where I typically see delays is they need to do a project, they don't have all the parts, they don't have all the pieces, right? And the entire team is stuck waiting for the truck to show up with that one other thing they need. At some point, when we have AI tracking projects like this and tying into procurement, it'll flag an alert and say, hey, you don't have the parts to do the next phase of this project. Automatically send an email to the client and reallocate those resources somewhere else until the parts available. I think
Right.
that's where it's going to wind up. How long it's going to take to get there is anybody's guess.
Right. Interesting. All right. So from a Josh does work in the compliance ecosystem perspective, what do you see? Are there questions or are there problems that manifest themselves regularly? Is there something that you are constantly asked to fix?
In the compliance space, what I'm constantly asked to fix, and I'm going to phrase it badly here, but it's usually a question around, we haven't been compliant for the last year, but we need to pass this audit. What can we do? Right. And, figuring out what's in the spirit of compliance versus what's the letter of compliance, and making sure the auditor knows that, maybe things weren't great before, but they're better now and we can prove it, right? That's what I get a lot of. And because that's contextual, there's not really a good fit for AI there today. AI needs a lot more context built into it. Now, from a compliance perspective of AI, which is not something you asked about, how does AI tie in with some of these compliance requirements? We have a fundamental conflict. And that conflict is some states and countries are passing laws saying that individuals have the right to not have algorithmic decisions made on their behalf. So, it's to get around bias in models. So if you think about people trying to get home loans, right? They want to get a mortgage, they want to buy a house. Back in the day, before we had credit scores, people were horribly abused in the process, right? It was not uncommon for lower income people from different races and classes to not get loans when the same type of people, if they were white, male, right, they would get the loan when their financials look the same. So as people move towards AI, we run the risk of biases in AI making decisions that would particularly harm individuals. Do I think we'll see it with mortgages? No, because we have a good legal framework around that. And I think everybody can say, if you use AI in this process, you have to have a human verifying it, and you have to have some sort of knowledge as to why the AI decided what it does. And we don't currently have an SBOM type equivalent for AI that says why it makes that decision. Where I'm concerned is when it starts applying decisions in healthcare, when it starts denying people treatment, because that is a broken process. That's a time-intensive process. Clearly, that's where people are going to want to put AI to make things faster, and making things faster and not better in that space risks lives and risks livelihoods and quality of life and all of that. I think that's where the big fight's going to be.
Interesting.
I just see it as AI will have, and you mentioned this briefly, a bias built in by whoever's programming it in the background. Whatever their bias is, left, right, up, down, doesn't matter. That particular AI will be biased to that person's point of view.
Yeah, so it's a little more complex than that, because what you just described is really how the bias got into that new Harry Potter game, all the anti-Semitic stuff, because it turns out the project lead was, accused, apparently rightly so, of being anti-Semitic in various ways. That is a person affecting a product. With AI, it comes to data sets. And it comes to, if they pull a bunch of data sets and train the AI on those data sets, if there's bias in the data sets, not individual bias, but cultural bias, it's going to be reflected in the AI itself. And there are not that many people with both a deep background in sociology and a deep background in data science to be able to identify and help us work around those issues. We'll get them, right? It's absolutely something we're going to need in the future. But today, it's a lot like security was 20 years ago, where there were so few people just doing computer security work that they all knew each other, right? That's where we're just starting with sociology and data review.
I have two questions. The first one is, so who or what ends up being the decider? Like, like who, how does that get determined? Which is somewhat of a rhetorical question. I'm assuming that there's not a great answer, but that to me is a question. Who's the arbiter of truth for all of this?
CEO.
Yeah.
Yeah, of any one company that's using AI, CEO is going to be the ultimate decider. And
Decider.
the tone that they set, the rules that they put in place, are going to dictate what other people do, how it's used, and things like that, right?
My other question is not related necessarily to AI, and it really kind of has to do with the compliance space in general. And that is, in the last, I'm going to say 3 to 5 years, I've seen a measured change in oversight relative to cybersecurity insurance, right? It used to be a form that you could put on a 3M sticky note.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a password? I'm obviously not
Yeah.
stating that correctly, but it used to be a very short, non-impactful process. And just in the last probably 2 years, I've seen it substantially uptick to where the cybersecurity procurement process has become similar to what HIPAA used to be as far as the assessment piece goes.
Yeah.
Question: how much of that drives the things that you see and have to do every day, and how much do you see that changing stuff going forward?
So I typically get a handful of cyber insurance questionnaires from clients that you help with it once a quarter. And it's problematic, right? And the problem is the insurers lost so much money over the last 2 years strictly due to ransomware that, I personally think, I don't have proof of this, but I think some well-known insurers are trying to exit the market and are making it so difficult to get insurance through them that their clients are just going to dry up. And then when they're low enough, they're going to sell off the business. I think a lot of people just don't want to be in this business, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Because in traditional insurance, you'll see carve outs against, say, I'll use arson as an example, right? And they carve out arson because arson is a deliberate action taken by a human to harm a business. And you can't control for that, right? You can't do mathematical models on that. I mean, sure, there are certain correlations, right? Arson is going to probably be bigger at companies that have meaner bosses, right? Companies that are perceived as being problematic, companies that want the insurance money, want to burn down their own business, right?
Mm-hmm.
So arson is blacklisted for coverage for that same reason. In the information security space, every event is arson because every event is triggered by another human choosing to cause harm. And I personally don't think it is insurable. I don't think there's a model that's going to work. And I think a lot of insurance companies are starting to realize this. I've been, trying to have that conversation now for a couple of decades, saying financial space is closed. Dollars are dollars. They move around. They don't duplicate. Hopefully, they don't just vanish most of the time. It's a closed space. Information security is an open space because anything anybody can think of goes, right? And you can't do a mathematical modeling of an open space in the same way you do in a closed space. It's just not going to work.
What do you think of the model of when you think about business, just a business, any business, what do you think about the models of recover versus protect? So
Yeah,
antivirus versus backup.
yeah. I think a lot of companies put far too much effort on prevention
Hmm.
and not nearly enough on resilience.
Hmm.
So it's not about recovery, right? It's about resilience. And I talk about this a lot when I talk about vendor management, right? A lot of people try to get the vendors down to the or up to the security level they have. But if a vendor could operate at your security level consistently, the financials for outsourcing in the first place wouldn't make sense, right? They get lower pricing, they get more efficiencies by taking on more risk. And it just doesn't really make sense in that world. And what you want to do is you want to build a program that gives you more resilience. So if a vendor screws up, you're not screwed yourself, right? And the
Hmm.
same applies across the industry. I'm not saying we should take all the money away from protection, take down our firewalls and things like
Hmm.
that. But we need to conserve some budget for fixing screw ups because there are going to be screw ups, and we don't know what form they're going to take. And having built out resilient infrastructure and having resilient process and training people that this is what your job normally looks like, sometimes weird stuff happens, and you're going to have to work on that too. That helps the business a lot more than just putting more dollars into more layers.
How do you see, what do you see as, let me take a step back. So as you know, in a past life, I came from a HIPAA slash PCI space, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I do like about what I do is I get exposed to different types of businesses and different verticals. Moving from that space into a customer who was agriculture based, right, was very interesting because the customer themselves had some fairly robust security requirements. Their vendor group did not.
Mm-hmm.
And so are you seeing any kind of a push to try to educate that vendor thing? Because what you just articulated strikes as true to me, and that is that you're going to have a weak link sometimes in the vendor pool, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you protect yourself against that? Is that something that you see and you run into? And if it is, how do you mitigate that? How do you
Well,
best mitigate that?
so the first thing is to recognize that when the decision to outsource is made, the business is automatically accepting the inherent risk of that choice, right? And it's like in retail, the concept of shrinkage. Some stuff's going to get stolen, right? You accept that. In the loan uh, servicing space, some loans will be defaulted. You accept that as a cost of doing business, right? We have to accept, when we outsource, there's a necessary risk that's there that the business says the risk's low enough. We're going to go ahead and accept it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
As far as passing requirements onto vendors, I try not to directly say, hey, vendor, you need to be doing X, right?
Hmm.
Now, there are some that are clear, right? I would say if you're going to access our systems, you're going to use our access control method, which means you're going to have MFA, you're going to have passwords of this length, you're going to have individualized user accounts. If you can't do that, you can't do business with us, right?
Hmm.
That's basic stuff. But as far as what the vendor does on their side, that follows their risk acceptance model. I don't have the power to say what that can happen. I do have the power to say contractually, if you have an incident that involves our data, you've got to work with our people. I can say, if you fail to meet these requirements, you can talk to our lawyers, right? There are different things you can do that make that acceptable. And you can do things internally, like one of the things I typically recommend, nobody really does it, unfortunately, but when you're generating data to send to a vendor that's going to process on your behalf, add a field that's unique to that vendor with something different for every single person. And then if that data gets leaked, you can identify which data set it came from, right? If you're sending them data and has social security numbers in it, right? Find out why. This is more of a problem in legacy financial processing, but I still see companies that get these massive data dumps from mainframes from banks because that's what the mainframe does. That's how it works. But they don't need 90% of the data. So why increase your risk and give them more than you need? Do a post process, strip it down to what's needed, inject that honey token so that if something's leaked, they can figure it out, renumber all of the people, right? So they're not using your number system, they're using a new number system you come up with for exchanging data with the vendor. So it's of no use, right? If somebody gets that data, it's minimal use for attacking. You can still adjust your processes to have it come back and forth, and it's much better. That's what resilience looks like. It's what can we do to make this risk the business has decided to accept lower.
Interesting. All right. We're almost to our end of time here. Does anybody else have any questions for Josh? We've had a couple good ones. Anybody else have any questions? Hearing none, maybe we'll transition. Piper, do you have the wheel of death, fun, and happiness ready to go?
Yes, I do.
Always cracks me up.
Yeah, I get corrected. So yeah, go ahead, Pipes. Let's I guess I'll switch our I'll let you share your screen because I had it set the wrong way.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate your
Looking
time.
at,
Thank you.
let's do the drawing or the wheel of death for the Subway sandwich. Do you have that up, Pipes, or do you need me to do it?
Yep, I got it.
Okay, all right.
Oh, I always hate when stuff pops up and
Well, you got a
you
50-50
see it.
chance.
All right, let's see if I can hide you guys too and close out of this and all of these extra ads. There we go. There's a circle. All right.
Just two of us?
Just the two of you guys
Just
today, I
the
guess.
two of us.
Oh no, Super Denny. Yet
There you
another meal for Denny. Awesome, very good. Well, Josh, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. I'll pass out the link for that for the comic book. So people can take a look at that. I would encourage you to look at it. I have a copy of it. I actually have a paper copy of it. I find it to be a very cool artifact. I find it to be interesting. I'd be lying if I said I didn't steal Josh's idea of using comics to or a comic book approach to explain things to people. I have stolen that a couple of times,
Works
but
well.
it does work well. People, if you have a message that you need to communicate, you need people to look at it, put it in a comic book and they'll look at it. I did a cat in the hat on security one time. It turned out pretty good. So
Nice.
anyways, no, very good. Well, Josh, thank you very much. And if anybody wants to get a hold of Josh, just let me know. We can provide contact information. And Josh is available to do consulting for security and compliance assessments and full engagements if needed. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Thanks, Josh.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.